Psalm 139 is deeply personal, attributed to King David. The psalm speaks to God's intimate knowledge of the individual and God's omnipresence. In this passage, David, a shepherd, warrior, and ruler, shows his deep emotional engagement with God. It reveals his feelings of awe, vulnerability, and assurance in the face of God's constant presence and knowledge of his heart. This psalm contrasts God's omnipresence and omniscience versus the limitations of human understanding, reflecting God's sovereignty and intimate care. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. David opens the psalm with a declaration of God's thorough knowledge of him. God's understanding of David is not superficial. He has searched him. The verbs here, sit and rise, are mundane actions illustrating that God cares about the smallest details of our lives. This reveals the intimacy of God's relationship with us. He knows not just what we do, but what we think. Today, we often feel misunderstood or alone, especially in a world where technology keeps us connected, yet strangely isolated. This verse reminds us that God knows us better than anyone. He understands our thoughts, anxieties, and joys without us even needing to speak. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Here, David emphasizes that God is aware of his daily routines and life patterns. He is not a God for big things, he's a God for all things. Whether David is active or resting, God is acquainted with all his ways. This shows God's constant observation and care. We can find great comfort in this idea. In a world that measures self-worth is based on our productivity, we sometimes feel the need to be always on. But God is present in both our efforts and our rest, even before a word is on my tongue. This is a profound reflection on the extent of God's foreknowledge, indicating that He is aware of our intentions and thoughts even before we act on them. In an age of texting, posting, emailing, and launching in nanoseconds without a thought, remember that God is aware of our words and their impact. We must be mindful of our words, vigilantly knowing that God is listening. You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Now David is speaking of God hemming him in, painting a protective image that shows God surrounding him. God's hand upon him signifies not just protection, but guidance and comfort. There have been times when life's uncertainties make us feel vulnerable, but on the other side of the trauma, when I marvel over God's bounty, like David, I became overwhelmed, reminding us that God's protection surrounds us, even when we feel exposed. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? The psalmist rhetorically asks whether there is any place they could go to escape God's presence. The implied answer is nowhere. This affirms that God is present everywhere, even in the most hidden or distant places. David proclaims that God is omnipresent everywhere. There's no place we can hide from his presence. Whether in the heights of heaven or the depths of Sheol, the place of the dead, God is there. Even in the remotest parts of the world, God's hand will guide and hold David. We all face moments of loneliness or abandonment, physically isolated or emotionally distant. Even in our darkest moments, ain't no mountain too high, no valley too low, river too wide, or day too dark to separate us from God. David concludes this lesson by reflecting on God's ability to see through the darkness, hate, fear, confusion, or evil. His light penetrates even the darkest situations. To him, the night is as clear as the day. In a world that often feels unpredictable and overwhelming, Psalm 139 assures us that God is both near and involved. As modern Christians, we can trust that God is walking beside us every step of the way, even when we can't sense his presence. This scripture invites us to live with a deeper awareness of God's constant care and to rest in the knowledge that his presence goes with us always. That's the lesson for this week. Have a great week.